Once upon a time, or rather, often enough, because the night never truly ends in the realm of the dark fae. Where do you think I am? Always at the threshold of endings, observing, narrating, harvesting. I am Morticia, the one who never hurries, who arrives at just the right moment. And the story I am about to tell tonight is about fairies, but not the kind filled with light and kindness. No, this tale is one of shadows and whispers, of broken promises and bonds that unravel. So, settle in comfortably, for this will be a journey both bitter and seductive. Our story begins in an isolated village, a nearly forgotten corner of the world, surrounded by dense, ancient forests that whispered secrets at dusk. The people of Evermorn Village feared those woods, never venturing too far from the fields, especially after dark. But there were 8 young souls in the village who, for reasons of their own, did not believe in fairy tales or old legends. They thought these were stories invented to control, to frighten. Lara, a young woman with dark skin and green eyes, was one of these young people. Raised by her grandmother, a stern old woman who believed in the old ways, Lara had heard tales of dark fairies since she was a child. Her grandmother used to say that these fae were beautiful, with angelic faces and breathtaking eyes, but full of tricks and hatred toward humans. And above all, she taught Lara the golden rule: never make a promise to a fairy. But Lara, with her rebellious heart, laughed at these stories. At 18, she thought she knew everything, like many her age. Among her friends was Elias, a mysterious young man known for his crooked smile and habit of mocking everything and everyone. He hid an old wound, the loss of his father when he was still a child. His mother, apathetic and marked by grief, never told him the details of the tragedy, and Elias grew up with a thirst to understand the inexplicable. Death isn't the end, he often said, it's just a detail. Other friends included Matthias, a quiet and observant boy who was fascinated by the plants that grew around the village, and Serena, a dreamy redhead who saw beauty everywhere but carried a sadness that no one could quite understand. Then there were the twins, Luca and Livia, inseparable, fearless, and full of an adventurous spirit that drove them to explore every corner of the village. Lastly, Aurelia and Gail, opposites in personality. Aurelia was a natural leader, pragmatic and determined, while Gail, shy, preferred to observe from afar, always hiding a faint, enigmatic smile. These young people formed a close-knit group, but they also carried secrets that they didn't even share with each other. One night, Elias, in a mixture of provocation and curiosity, suggested they venture into the forest. Let's see if there really is something there, like the old women in the village say, or if it's all just stories to keep us under control, he said with that challenging smile. Lara was the first to support the idea. It's time we proved these legends are just nonsense, she said firmly. Serena hesitated, but her desire to be part of the group won out. And one by one, they all agreed. Gail, however, was the last to join, uneasy. What if it's true, he murmured, but then laughed at his friend's impatient looks. Fine, I'll go with you. The following night, under the light of the full moon, they set out into the forest. The first steps were filled with laughter and jokes, but as the path narrowed and the forest thickened, silence enveloped them. Towering trees with twisted trunks and branches that resembled outstretched hands loomed over them like dark sentinels. And then the first sign appeared, a trail of luminescent flowers, a blue-green glow that shone like fallen stars. Strange, these flowers shouldn't grow here, murmured Matthias, enchanted and confused. Strange? I think it's beautiful. Serena whispered, fascinated, brushing one of the petals with her fingertips. But the moment she touched it, a soft laugh echoed through the trees. Who's there? Aurelia called out, her tone authoritative, hiding her fear. From the midst of the shadows, 3 figures of supernatural beauty emerged. Their skin was pale, as if reflecting the moonlight, and their eyes shone in an almost hypnotic way. They wore flowing dresses that seemed woven from mist and leaves, and a sweet, heady fragrance filled the air around them. The tallest of the 3 smiled, tilting her head toward the young people. Well, visitors, she said, her voice soft and deadly as poison. Who are you? Luca asked, his voice trembling. Fairies, replied the second one, with silver hair and eyes narrowing in an almost predatory gaze. You're in our domain, young mortals. Lara laughed as if it were all a joke. Dark fairies? Do you expect us to believe that? But Gale, trembling, looked different from the others. He knew, he'd always known, that these stories held a kernel of truth. The third fairy, with eyes as dark as a starless sky, approached him, running her slender fingers over his face. "You believe, don't you, dear? Don't worry. We promise to protect your friends." Her voice was a hypnotic whisper, but Lara, headstrong, interrupted. "And what would this protection cost us?" "A small agreement," replied the silver-haired fairy, her smile soft but sinister. "You offer us a small part of your dreams, and in return we promise you safety." "We have nothing to fear," Elias declared in a reckless act of bravado. But the fairy laughed, a sound so cold it sliced through the air. "Ah, yes, human courage, but fear is an inevitable gift when you stand in our presence," she said, while another fairy murmured something in a forgotten language, and the world around them seemed to shift. The trunks of the trees closed in, the path back disappearing before their eyes. Serena was visibly frightened, yet her curiosity overcame her fear. "What happens if we make this deal?" "Only this," replied the dark-eyed fairy, raising her hands. "You promise us what is most precious, your deepest dreams. Not the dreams of the night, no, but the desires of the heart. In return, we can take you to a world where your lives will be intense." Aurelia tried to resist, saying they didn't need protection, but as she looked into the fairy's eyes, she hesitated. There was something strange there, a bitter truth she did not want to accept. And slowly, one by one, the young people were drawn in by the fairy's promise. Lara was the first to promise. "You can have my dreams," she said, convinced she didn't believe in them. In her mind, all this was a farce, a strange joke. Then it was Elias's turn, driven by his pain and disillusionment. He laughed in contempt and murmured, "I have nothing to lose." Matthias, Serena, Luca, Livia, Aurelia, and finally, the reluctant Gale followed the same path, each making a promise, each offering something. The fairies smiled, satisfied, and in the blink of an eye, the young ones were swallowed by darkness. In the weeks that followed the encounter with the fairies, a strange stillness hung over the village, like an invisible mist that everyone could feel but not see. It was a dense absence, almost tangible, a sense that something vital had drained away. Slowly, the villagers began whispering about the changes that seemed to be afflicting the group of young people. Lara, the fearless one, with her infectious smile and bright eyes, now moved as if weighed down by 1,000 sleepless nights. Her green eyes, which once sparkled like emeralds in the sunlight, had lost their color. They were empty, opaque, like two lifeless stones. Villagers noticed her new posture, always with her head down, shoulders slumped, steps slow. She no longer spoke as she used to, no longer laughed, no longer defied. It was as if her rebellious spirit had been extinguished, leaving only a shell, a distant echo of who she once was. Elias, the one who was most defiant and quick to laugh, had become a shadow of himself. The sarcastic smiles and defiant nature were replaced by a heavy silence, laden with something unspeakable. It was the kind of silence that brought with it an unbearable tension, as if he bore something terrible within, something he dared not share, even with his friends. He avoided any conversation, his gaze dark and distant, almost cold. From time to time, people would see him standing, staring at the horizon with such a distant look that he seemed lost among the shadows of the trees, as if seeing something only he could perceive. Then there was Matthias, the attentive observer, who had always shown fascination for trees, for birdsong, for the rustling leaves in the wind. He seemed unrecognizable. He, who once found beauty in every wildflower that grew between stones, now looked at nature with an apathy that caused discomfort in those who saw him. It was as if everything around him had been shrouded in a gray veil, erasing the charm of every detail. His hands, once restless and skilled, now hung without purpose. He wandered along the village paths like a lost soul, his eyes devoid of life, without the glimmer of curiosity that always accompanied him. Anyone who passed him on the village paths or in the forest felt that something strange lingered in him, a kind of sadness that went beyond the visible world, something rooted in his very being. Serena, the dreamer who always found beauty even in the simplest things, now saw the world as if it had been drained of color. Her memories of the forest, the leaves that glowed in the morning light, the flowers that opened with the touch of the sun, the streams that danced among the stones, had become faded, cold. The vibrant colors of the flowers no longer touched her. The sky, which she once loved to watch, seemed empty and distant, without the deep blue that had enchanted her. It was as if, upon crossing the fairies' path, something within her had been stifled, silenced, and with each passing day her gaze grew more opaque, as if her spirit itself were slipping away, escaping in small sighs. The twins Luca and Livia, inseparable and fearless, were affected in a peculiar way. Luca, who had always been the boldest, the one who led the adventures with a boisterous laugh and defiant words, now walked in a withdrawn manner, almost haunted. Livia, his mirror, his reflection of energy and enthusiasm, seemed disconnected, as if she no longer recognized the brother by her side. They both seemed lost, as if the bonds that united them had unraveled, as if something deep and dark had seeped between them, robbing them of the synchrony of souls they had always shared. Whatever it was, the fairies had left a mark that separated the two halves of the same life, like a broken mirror. Aurelia, the fearless leader, was now a hesitant shadow. Once strong and steadfast, the young woman was now overwhelmed by a restlessness she had never known. Her decisions, once filled with confidence, were now tinged with unbearable doubts. The promise she had made to the fairies weighed on her like an invisible chain, tightening around her, suffocating her. She wandered aimlessly through the village, her steps disjointed, her face showing the expression of someone who had lost her way. Each movement was permeated with deep regret, a sadness that seemed to infect the surroundings, as if her anguish were seeping out and reaching everything around her. And finally, Gale, the most timid and introspective, who had hesitated so long before agreeing to the promise. More than anyone, he felt the presence of the fairies and the darkness they had cast upon him. His lost gaze and the slight tremor in his hands were signs of a fear that none of the others seemed to fully understand. Gale knew there was something darker, something terrible lurking in the shadows of his own mind. He was the one who most felt the black hole in his chest, that emptiness that grew day by day, fed by broken promises and stolen dreams. Each of them, little by little, drifted away from the others, like castaways stranded on their own islands of despair. Hallucinations began to take hold, distorted images appearing in moments of silence and solitude. Lara saw figures in the shadows, faces she didn't recognize, whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand, yet they seemed to awaken strange, fragmented memories. Elias, who had sought a kind of release from the fairies, was now pursued by visions of glowing eyes and cold laughter echoing through the dark hallways of his home. He tried to ignore it, to hide, but the sound always seemed closer, inescapable. Gale, with his lost gaze, felt an even greater terror. He knew, deep in his soul, that the fairies had taken something too precious, something he would never be able to reclaim. It was as if his very essence had been stolen, leaving behind an insatiable void that devoured him from within. It was an absence so deep, so painful, that every breath became a burden, every thought a torture. Serena, who had once seen beauty in the world, was now haunted by a darkness that loomed over her mind. Days became long, gray, and the nights endless. Her heart beat with a sadness she had never known, a sadness that now felt like part of her, like an inseparable shadow. The sunlight she once loved had become a distant reflection of a happiness that no longer belonged to her. Aurelia, the leader, felt an oppressive sense of responsibility. It was as if every misstep, every thoughtless decision had led her friends to this ruin. She looked at each of them and felt the weight of what they had lost. It was a burden she carried alone, silently, knowing her voice would find no echo in the devastated minds of her companions. The fairies had promised an intensity they would never understand, and this promise had been fulfilled in a cruel, distorted way. Now each of them lived in a state of deep despair, of unsatisfied longing, in a reality that had become a nightmare. They were like lost souls, empty, wandering a world that no longer offered them solace or peace. And I, Morticia, the eternal observer, the one who patiently waits in the shadows, knew that my visit would soon be necessary. Ruin was near, hanging like a sharp blade over the village. Then, on a cold dawn, the silence was broken. A shadowy breeze swept through the streets, whispering secrets from the depths of the forest, and the fairies, those treacherous creatures, were hungry. They awakened to their wicked dance, drawn by the bitter taste of suffering. They danced around their targets, invisible to all but one weary heart that could no longer bear the weight. Aurelia, the leader who had taken the burden of their choices upon herself, was the first to fall. Her soul, consumed by regrets, gave in to the unbearable weight. On that final night, she felt a tightness in her chest and a weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. Alone in her room, with only the moonlight as her witness, she felt her body grow heavier. Her mind clouded with memories of the past. The fairies' voices invaded her head, words in a sweet tone but sharp as blades. She closed her eyes, exhausted, and let out her last breath, her body relaxing into a dreamless sleep. It was then that I approached, crossing the invisible veil that separates the living from the lost. The fairies surrounded her, dancing in a circle around her lifeless form, their smiles ravenous and satisfied. They had feasted, drawn from her the last fragments of hope and light. Aurelia was now only a pale shadow of what she once had been, and her essence, consumed by the dark beings, hung in the air, vulnerable, about to be devoured. "She is mine now," I said gravely, and the fairies hesitated, their eyes sparking with rage and hunger. I faced them in silence, my presence cold and implacable, and they knew this was the limit. Reluctantly, the fairies withdrew into the shadows, their whispers dissipating, for they knew death was an end they would not dare to defy. I knelt beside Aurelia, her expression now serene, and with a gentle gesture I gathered her soul, cold and light, yet still resonating with the remnants of a life intense with dreams and regrets. She was at last mine. I would take her soul to a rest that no fairy's enchantment could disturb, to a fate where the shadows of promises could no longer reach her. As I walked back, I felt the presence of the other young ones, their lives still tethered but fragmented, each of them teetering on the thin border between light and darkness. I looked upon them, knowing the fate that awaited each one, and I knew I would soon return.